Oxygen Blast technical seminars are an Intertech production. For instructor-led .NET, Java, and XML courses, visit us at www.intertech.com.
Hi, my name is Davin Michelson, and I'm one of the instructors at Intertech, and I teach a course that I wrote on Complete ASP.NET 4.0, a course for the .NET 4.0 framework. I do have several certifications in this, and I'm a certified trainer. I've been working with Intertech now for about 5 years, and I do love working with these technologies. This is going to be a brief primer, if you will, a subset of the first chapter of 16 chapters that I normally deliver when you come to Intertech and take the 5-day training course on ASP.NET. My email address is right there as well, davin@intertech.com, if you need to contact me about any questions of the courses we offer or anything else you might be working on. So, in this chapter here, we're going to be discussing the core features of ASP.NET, as well as some of the different tools that make up ASP.NET. As well, we'll talk about the history of Visual Studio's ASP.NET web development, where we are right now with Visual Studio 2010, and why we have these two different architectures, Visual Studio websites versus a web application project. Again, this is a subset of what we normally deliver in the first chapter, but I wanted to keep it within an hour here. So the core ASP.NET features, of course. When we do web development, with whatever technology we happen to be using, we know that we always have the option of creating web pages that are just static HTML and the included JavaScript that might be with the actual page. Those are the only two languages that web browsers understand. Web browsers understand HTML and JavaScript, and anything else, you're going to need a custom plugin, for example, like Silverlight or Flash or something of that nature. So that's all that we can ever send to a web browser from the web server. And technically, you can create a website that's very secure and very fast if you create all your content as just raw HTML or XHTML, which is the XML version of HTML, and just JavaScript. Now, mind you, the problem is when you start to have several different pages in your site, it gets to be much more complicated to go ahead and maintain that. So earlier technologies, of course, tried to address this, and they did successfully. ASP, CGI, Perl, Cold Fusion, JSP, we can go on and on with the list here of some other technologies that came about because it was so tough to manage the content that was within our web pages. Oftentimes we wanted to generate that content dynamically based on the data that might be stored in a data store, such as SQL Server, for example, or Oracle. So what we would do is we dynamically generate that content. Like in active server pages, ASP, we would use a language called VBScript or JScript to go ahead and dynamically generate that content. With CGI and Perl, for example, that was another way of generating that content, or maybe Cold Fusion. Ultimately, though, all that ever got sent back to the browser was just HTML and JavaScript because, again, that's all the browsers would understand. And if you tried to be tricky and include something else like, well, I don't know, back in the old days we had ActiveX controls. As soon as you use that, well, great, it worked in Internet Explorer, but it didn't work in any of the other browsers out there or on any of the other platforms other than Windows. ASP, Perl, Cold Fusion, in the earlier versions, they were not fully compiled. They were interpreted. It reminds me of the old BASIC language I used to work with on my VIC-20. They were interpreted at runtime to generate that content. They weren't actually compiled, mind you. They were scripts. Now with .NET, we do have real languages, not to rip on VBScript or anything, but we have real .NET languages such as C# or VB, and it is compiled. It's compiled into .NET assemblies. So it is more secure as well. We're not putting our source code necessarily on our web server. The web server is typically the target where hackers like to attack first. So, that was the worst idea about ASP. Let's take all our source code and let's leave it open source and put it on the machine that's most likely to get hacked. That was a big problem with some of those earlier technologies. And now with .NET, and you see this with other technologies such as Java as well, everything being compiled, of course, is going to give you higher performance and it's going to be increased security. As well, with .NET, we do have object orientation. We do have an object-oriented language such as C# or VB. And mind you, neither of those two languages really have one advantage over the other. They do have additional features that the other language doesn't support. But even then, with each new release of .NET, Microsoft is playing catch-up with the two languages. Like, for example, C# just got optional parameters, right? Catching up with what VB has had all along. But VB still doesn't support being able to directly manipulate the memory. For example, like working with pointers, and even though C# can still do that. ASP.NET also takes advantage of what comes along with the .NET framework. For example, ASP.NET uses the common type system. This is that common set of variable types that we have in any of the .NET languages. Use any .NET language, you're going to find these 15 standard types, whether it be integer, string, boolean, long, short, byte, all of that good stuff. Once you learn those types in one of the .NET languages, of course, they're the same for all the languages. And ASP.NET uses those same types as well. And note that we also have automatic memory management called the garbage collector. That comes along with .NET as well. And of course, web applications are compiled just in time before execution. Now with these languages, VB and C#, know that of course C# was invented with the .NET framework at the exact same time, and it is very, very close to the Java language. VB, however, is 20 years old now. I'm recording this here in 2011, and VB came out back in 1991. Technically, VB is a form of BASIC, which came out much before that. BASIC came out, oh man, back in the 60s. But with VB itself, it is designed for, of course, enabling us to create applications with a language that is not case sensitive. And of course, with the editors, they help make it as easy as possible to write code. Both VB and C# have the exact same strengths, though. The tenets of object-oriented programming with encapsulation, inheritance, and polymorphism, of course, those are all taken advantage of with the ASP.NET framework. They leverage that. And when they first came out with ASP.NET back in 2002 of February with Visual Studio 2002, when they came out with ASP.NET, they wanted to make it easy as possible for Windows Forms developers. Maybe those developers have been creating client-server applications in C++ or VB. Maybe with MFC, right? That was something we used in C++. They want to make it easy as possible for those folks to transition over to the web world because the web was growing so popular. Previously, before .NET, Microsoft had this technology called DNA, Distributed Internet Applications, which is primarily based on classic ASP pages with compiled COM objects that we would write in either VB or C++. So in order to make it as easy as possible for the VBers as well as the Windows C++ developers to come over to the web world, they created this forms framework called ASP.NET, which allows you, as the developer, to drag and drop controls onto the form. Now note that any other library that's included within .NET, like for example working with generics, which were released with .NET 2.0, some of the different types of collections, working with different data sources, entity framework, for example, link to SQL, any of the other things that make up .NET are available to you as an ASP.NET developer. All you need to do is add a reference to the DLL if you don't already have the reference, and away you go. You can, of course, also use DLLs that you might have created yourself, whether it be in C++, VB, whether it be COM-based or whether they're .NET-based, it doesn't matter. The ASP.NET web space does have, or the web namespace, if you will, does have a lot of different types that we can use from ASP.NET. And of course, as I said, you can even use COM-based DLLs. Maybe you're migrating from classic ASP over to the .NET world. You can still add a reference to those COM objects and then use them from your .NET application. One of the things Microsoft put a lot of energy into was making it as easy as possible for people to transition from the COM-based world over to the .NET world. Microsoft's not creating a new version of COM. COM is not dead, but they're done with it, if you will. Very similar to Windows application development, ASP.NET Forms development does still handle the event-driven model like we had with Windows development. So like, for example, you can handle a click event for a Windows button and then write the code within that event handler. We can still do that same thing in the web world as well. They wanted to make it as similar as possible so that our client-server developers could transition over to the web world. Now, we do have a request and response web paradigm. Now, what is that really talking about? Of course, we know that if you're doing any form of web programming, we typically have a web browser, which could be Internet Explorer, Mozilla Firefox, Google Chrome, Opera, Apple Safari, and it could be running in any of those versions of those browsers, and it could be running on any platform. Whatever browser you happen to be using, it's going to make a request to the server for a particular web page. The server is going to either return the page just the way it is, or generate a dynamic HTML page with perhaps some embedded JavaScript and maybe some inclusion of CSS, send it back to the client, which is the web browser, and it's going to disconnect. One big thing about the web world is it's a disconnected environment. We never maintain a live connection with the server unless we're actually streaming some video or something of that nature. Request, response, disconnect. We do that every single time we click on a link, and the server asks the exact same question every single time that request is made, and that question is, who are you, what do you want, and should you have access? It asks those questions every single time you click on a link. Now, of course, all web browsers, regardless of their capability, can render ASP.NET. That's simply because .NET is not required on the client. The only thing required on the client is the web browser itself, because all that ASP.NET dishes out is just HTML and JavaScript.
For more free learning resources and to see the latest lineup of our instructor-led .NET, Java, and XML courses, visit us at www.intertech.com.